In another video, we went over the basics of using Adobe Illustrator to conduct some basic shape building in an exercise. In this video, I'm going to go through some of the same tools and topics using Figma, because I know not everybody has access to the Adobe tools, although if you're continuing to pursue graphic design, you really should get comfortable with them and you really should get yourself access to them outside of the classroom. That being said, I'm hoping this one is a little bit shorter because I'm not going to go through kind of everything in as much detail. So let's get started. If you followed the Figma link and you've gotten yourself signed up with a education account, this should be the screen that you have ended up on for exercise 2. The first thing to do is to make a copy of this file because this is the master template. So you'll click the little drop down arrow next to the file name, select duplicate, and then once this creates a copy, you can move that copy to your drafts in our Figma team. So I can do that by clicking the drop down again, going to move, and then moving this into my drafts. And while I'm working with some organization stuff, I'm going to go ahead and rename the file. I'll just name it Muffet Exercise 2, something that makes sense so I can find it. Okay, another quick setup thing that I would recommend is to change some of your preferences by selecting the Figma icon, going to Preferences, and then I recommend always using a mouse when you can, and use scroll wheel to zoom, and use right click and drag to pan, because it makes navigating the file just a little bit easier. So to move around the file, I can use my mouse wheel to scroll in and out. Right click will move me around the screen, and then my left click I can select things. So Figma works much like Illustrator, although it's important to note off the bat that this is not meant to be a general design software. So the way that I am suggesting you use it in this class, if you do use it, is as kind of a workaround or a little bit of a janky hack, because Figma is meant to be a digital product design software. And so a lot of the features and the tools and the things you're going to see in here are really meant for designing mockups of screen-based applications and not necessarily for typography and illustration and some of the projects we're going to do in this class. So just keep that in mind as you're working through things. The program isn't necessarily going to be as user-friendly or as straightforward as Adobe might be. In other ways, it's much nicer too, so just something to keep in mind. Okay, so let's get started. The first difference to note is that Figma works in what are called frames, not artboards. So in Illustrator, we had the artboards tool. In Figma, up here, we have the frame tool, which you can select with F on your keyboard. So a frame is just a container for other stuff inside of it, which you can see in the layers panel over here with this little hash symbol. By default, a blank frame will have a fill, and you add fills and strokes over here in the right panel in the properties section. You won't need to add any frames here because I've already added them to this exercise file. So the first thing we're going to do is create a square with a solid fill and no stroke. So you can see right off the bat, I have a rectangle tool. In Figma, the shortcut for that is R. And just like Illustrator, I can use that to click and drag out. And if I hold Shift, it will constrain that shape to a perfect square. If I wanted to change that fill color, I could do so over here, as well as the opacity if I wanted to. For a circle, similar deal, I can click and hold to get some other shape building tools underneath the rectangle tool. I'm going to grab the ellipse tool, which is O. And then just like Illustrator, I can build this out from the center and scale it proportionally by holding Alt on my keyboard. I believe that would be Option on the Mac. And just like with Illustrator, we can easily change the color of things by pressing I, which gives us an eyedropper tool, and I can grab the shape of something else. The Shift X shortcut does still work to swap the fill and the stroke, but the other way to add a stroke to something is to click the plus over here in the Properties panel, and then I can change the color and change the scale of that, and then remove the fill with the minus key, or the minus icon there. So there is our circle with no fill and a solid stroke that is of a color besides black. The triangle, we do have a polygon tool in Figma. It functions a little bit differently than it does in Illustrator. So by default, this will create a triangle. I can make this equilateral by holding Shift. And to add a dashed stroke, I would add the stroke over here. And then to make it dashed, I would have to click the advanced stroke settings with the ellipses here, and then change the stroke style to dashed. And we could change the gap here to make those a little smaller if we wanted to. Similar to Illustrator. The difference from Illustrator in the polygon tool is I still have that selected. The way you change the number of sides is over here in the Properties panel. So we get this option that says Count, and it has these 4 points on it. You'll notice as I scale that up, so I'm clicking and dragging in there, I get additional points on my polygon. So to make this a pentagon, I just drag that up to 5 or type 5 in, and we get a pentagon. Moving on to the quadrilateral, here we are getting into Figma's version of what Illustrator calls the direct selection tool. So I'm going to grab my rectangle, and let's first make a rectangle. And I'm going to make this a little bit transparent just so we can see sort of our guides behind there. So you'll notice underneath our selection tool, we have a scale tool. We do not have something called the direct selection tool. The way we can grab individual points to pull those in Figma is by double clicking on the shape. And you'll see that we enter this alternate mode with a few different tools. And when I hover over it, I get these diagonal lines. The other way to get into that edit object mode is by selecting the shape, and then up here in the top bar, this first icon says edit object. We can select that, and it gives us the same options. So now we can select individual points, and I can click and drag the ones that I have selected and move them as I need to. And you'll see I get some similar smart guides here that we get in Illustrator. And when I click out, I can double click out, or I can click done to enter back into our regular editing mode. So there is our quadrilateral. To construct some more complex shapes, we do not have the shape builder tool in Figma, but we do have some of the options that we had in Pathfinder. So let's go ahead and make our circle first. And then if we think about how to construct a half circle, we need to basically cut this in half. So we need to give ourselves something to cut it in half with. So I'm going to draw a rectangle because really what I need is this top line here. And then I'm going to use that smart guide to perfectly center it. And I'm going to change this color just so you can see which object is in front and which is behind. If I select multiple objects, I'm holding Shift to individually select them, but you can also click and drag. I get this option here, which is the 2 squares up at the top. And this gives us a lot of the same options that we get in Illustrator under Pathfinder. So I'm going to use subtract selection, which does the same thing that minus front does in Illustrator. And when I select that, you'll see I'm left with the half circle. The same goes for the square with the circle missing. This is just additional practice with that same concept. Since we don't have the shape builder tool, we need to do this the same way that we did with the last one. And I'm going to go ahead and change the color of this. And to get these to line up perfectly together, let's just pretend this is off center. We can use our align options, which appear up here at the top of the properties panel. And I'm going to first align the horizontal centers, and then while they're both still selected, align the vertical centers. And you'll see this is now perfectly centered inside the square. For working with our the radius of our corners, here I'll go ahead and draw a square. And what we want to do here is just round this top right corner. So, oops, let me get out of that object editing mode. Just like Illustrator, if I just click and drag on one, it will round all of them. In order to just edit one, I can either open up the independent corners option in the properties panel, and you'll see I get four options, just like I have 4 corners. I could edit it here. Probably the easier thing to do here is to hold Control, which will let me grab just that corner, and I can pull that in and round it. The combined diamonds, the rotate works just like it does in Illustrator, so I won't go through this in detail. You can go ahead and hold Shift to constrain our rotation. And I can scale this by clicking and dragging on the corners. If you have something odd that won't scale properly, you can use the scale tool, which is K on your keyboard, and that will work in much the same way. Just like in Illustrator, holding Alt while you click and drag on something lets you duplicate it. And then we're going to use the Pathfinder and Unify selection to make this one solid shape. Minus front will work the same way with the circle with the piece cut out. So next I'm going to go ahead and draw a square. Align that to the center there, and then subtract selection to minus the front. Star has its own tool in Figma, which is underneath the shapes. So I can click and drag out on that. You can add more points here by increasing this option over here. And then I believe this angle is the way that we, determine sort of the angle of the star shapes. So you can increase that to make it shallower or deeper, more of an acute angle. The overlapping circles filled with the center missing. I'm first going to draw my 2 shapes, holding Alt to get a duplicate. And then under my Pathfinder options, I'm going to exclude the selection. You can tell by the icon here that we're going to be left with the filled parts on the outside, which will cut out the center here. And then the exact opposite for being left with what's in the middle. So I can make another copy, and then if I just want this piece, I can use intersect selection, which will give me the petal. We can also use Pathfinder options with groups of objects. So if I draw 3 triangles here, I can group them by selecting all of them can go to right click and group selection. The faster thing to do is to use Control or Command G. Then this becomes a grouped object. Because I don't have the direct selection tool, if I needed to edit some of these things, I could double click into it to edit them. But you can also grab things in groups by holding the Control key on your keyboard. And that kind of functions to select one object within a group, and you can edit it. But that's not the point here. The point here is we want to cut these out of a circle. So I'm going to change the color on these just so we can see what we're working with. And then I need my circle. I'll draw my circle, and then I'll change the fill to black. I can send this to the back because I made it over top of everything else by right-clicking, and then I can use the bracket keys you can see here or the options to send to the back. The reason we can't see it now is because we sent it all the way behind the artboard, but you can find it over here in the Layers panel. So you can see group 1 is the triangles, and then this is the ellipse 12. I'm going to center these, again using our alignment tools, vertically and horizontally. And then I can use subtract selection to cut out the center of that shape. Okay, the last thing we have to do here is to export our work. So to export everything as a PDF, you can do that by going to Figma, File, Export Frames to PDF. That will export anything that is in a frame to its own PDF page. You can see here that this is one of the files that you need to turn in. And then the other instruction is to export your favorite artboard, the favorite kind of shape you made, and export it as a PNG. The way that you do that is you first need to select that frame. And you can see I have most of these locked here so that we don't accidentally move the guide images around. But let's say I wanted to export our last one. I can see up here that this is frame 14. So I can select that over here in the Layers panel. So if I hit plus here, you'll see that I get a similar screen to what we got in Illustrator, where we can select the file format. We could add additional exports. You get some additional options here in the flyout menu, but the default, this 1x PNG, is fine for us. So I'm going to export that, and I get a PNG. Oops, it looks like our ellipse was not in the frame. Okay, this is a good opportunity to show that in order to export an object in a frame, it has to be inside the frame. So you can see this is named subtract. For that to actually export with our frame, this is part of the semi-janky things about Figma, I have to click and drag it and actually place it inside frame 14. So now that that's in here, over here in the Layers panel, now when I export this, we should get the whole thing. There we go. So those are some of the differences between Illustrator and Figma. I hope this was helpful, especially for those of you who have limited access to the Adobe Suite outside of class. I use Figma all the time, so it's totally plausible to get through the class and to do good work using the program. You just have to keep in mind that it is a little bit different, and all the instructions for doing things won't be exactly the same, but it is a fast and a cheap way to get some quick vector graphic editing done.